In this video, I'm going to be going over the differences in bump mapping and displacement mapping. And I'm going to be using a brick shader as our point of reference. So in a new scene, go ahead and add a sphere and increase the size of that sphere. This is just going to be our starting object. And I'm going to create a new material by going to File, New Material. I'm going to name this material, well, it doesn't really matter what the name is, so I'll just call it Bump Example. And so we can see them side by side. I'll make another sphere and call this first sphere Bump Sphere. And the second sphere I'm going to name Displacement Sphere. Excuse me. And I'm also going to make a copy of my bump map here. And I'm going to call this Displacement Example. I'm going to apply my bump material to my bump sphere and my displacement material to my displacement sphere. I'm going to go ahead and start by adjusting my bump material. So double click on that. And before we start making any changes, let's turn on interactive render region so that we can see what's happening with these spheres. I'm going to press and hold on my render button and choose interactive render region. What that gives me is a live rendered view of my viewport and these spheres. The first thing I'm going to do is turn on bump, again for my bump example, and to turn it on and click on the check mark next to it. And what bump does is it takes a picture or a procedural shader, so that's a computer generated picture, and it takes the white values and it makes them appear high, and it takes the black values and it makes them appear low. A good starting point is to click on this triangle and choose noise. Noise is a very useful tool. What it does is it creates a black and white material that looks like what you see right here. Just a variation of black and white values. And again now, the white areas here are the peaks and the black areas are the valleys. And you can see that represented in our image. I'm going to increase the quality of my preview render by dragging this triangle up. You can see it a little bit better now. But the thing about bump is that it doesn't actually make your surface bumpy. It only makes it appear that way. If you look at the edge of our surface, we can see that it's still a perfect sphere, no matter how bumpy it looks in the middle. Displacement is similar, but different. What displacement does is it actually takes the points of your sphere and it moves them around. So go to your displacement texture, turn on displacement, and load in the noise shader. So click on that triangle and choose noise. And you can see that this image right here starts to look like a pokey ball, and our sphere here is not changing its shape in any way to represent that. And the reason that is happening is all spheres by default have the render perfect option turned on. So no matter how close to them you get, they always look like a perfect sphere. So I'm going to turn off render perfect, and it's going to turn my sphere into a polygonal sphere, and it will allow my displacement to affect my sphere. Right now the height of my displacement is 5 meters, so it's very minimal. If I increase that to something like 50, we'll start to see the effects of the displacement on our sphere. Now, it doesn't look nearly as detailed as what we have in our texture preview. And that's because our sphere here, if I was to turn off my interactive render region, we would see it doesn't have that many polygons or points. So when it's pushing these points out along their normals, or the direction they're facing, it's only able to push just a few of them. To get a better quality displacement, I can increase my number of segments, and I'm going to turn my interactive render region back on, and now you can see the quality is improving. I'm going to have to put in a whole lot of segments before it starts looking smooth. Now the difficulty with this is it has now slowed down my editor considerably, and we don't really see this detail until render time. So I'm going to lower my segments back down to 24, and I'm going to activate an option in my displacement, which is to turn on sub-polygon displacement. And what that says is add detail at render time. So when I turn that on, I now get 4 subdivisions at render time. You want to set this number as low as you can while still getting a good appearance, because it does add considerably to your renders. 4 seems to be doing it, and 5 is even more detailed. Both bump and displacement have the same image loaded into them, but they have very different looking results. Use displacement for large-scale surface changes, and use bump for fine surface detail. Bump is a lot faster, and when you don't need to be able to cast shadows. Let me add a light so you can see what I mean. So adding a light, you can see that it has a much different effect, and if I add a shadow to this light, it's even more pronounced, the difference between these two. So when would be a good time to use displacement? Well, if you wanted, instead of all of this really high frequency noise, if you were to make it a larger noise, like say increase the global scale to 1000, we would just be distorting the shape of our sphere. We're getting some weird artifacts here, and that's because we're using subpolygon displacement. If you turn on round geometry, it should sort most of those out. Now you can also combine displacement mapping and bump mapping, and this would be a good candidate. So if I was to turn on bump, I could load in a noise shader, and I would get these large changes in shape because of displacement, and I'd still get that fine detail thanks to my bump. And if you were to in fact take this noise and lower its scale to something like 10%, you'd get a very fine level of detail. Now to go into a more real-world example, which is that of a brick wall. This is my end result, and let me show you the textures that make this happen. Let me see if I can't find them. I downloaded them from cgtextures.com, which is a really great online texture resource. So I'm going to open up these images so you can take a look at them. This is my bump map. Again, the white values here are bringing things out, and the black values are making them recede. This is my color map, and this is what's providing color for these bricks. And then there's something here, I've downloaded a normal map, which we won't really be getting into, so ignore that I showed you that. To create this brick texture, you're not going to have access to these images unless you go to CG Texture and download something like them. So just go ahead and take a look. I'm going to add a plane. I'm going to change its orientation to -z, and I'm going to zoom in on that plane. I'm going to create a new material, and in the color channel, I'm going to load in that brick color. It's going to say, do I want to create a copy of this? At this moment I don't. I'm just going to drag it onto my plane there and render. What we get here is something that already looks pretty good, and that's the benefit of using real-world textures. So photo-based textures, they have the look of realness because they come from the real world. If we turn on bump mapping, we can load in our bump shader, or excuse me, our bump texture. And now when we render, we get something that starts looking even better. You can adjust the strength of the bump to really exaggerate that effect. But bump is really great in that you can see how it affects the way light plays on our object. And you'll really see this if we were to, say, add an intense specular and increase its width. You can see how it's picking up highlights on the edges here. Now the one problem is that if we were to add a light with shadows, we wouldn't be casting shadows. And that's because there's no depth yet to these bricks. So to give those bricks depth, I'm going to turn off bump and turn on displacement and load in my brick bump texture. And now you can see that it started to sort of give an undulating pattern to this. And the reason it's not giving us fine detail is because we haven't turned on subpolygon displacement. Just go ahead and turn that on. I'm going to go up to a subdivision of 5 to get a lot of really fine detail. And I can adjust the height here, something like 3 meters. And those are the main differences between, again, displacement and bump mapping. And sometimes the best is the combination of the two, wherein you're using your bump map for some high-level detail. Right now, I'm not getting sharp bumps, and that's because I've got a little bit of blur on here. So if I set my blur scale to -100 and my blur offset to -100, that should give me a little bit more fine detail. And there you go. Thank you very much for watching.